whether you like it or no, you're almost certainly having a lot of custom resource definitions in your Kubernetes doing different things. Because once you understand the extensibility model of Kubernetes, and especially custom resource definitions and operators, you will be using that knowledge to go faster through the other topics.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 136, Teaching Kubernetes to a New Team Member. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. In the previous episode, we were talking about migrating everything to Kubernetes. Now, Magic Hand Wave, we're successful in doing that. We know that that's not true, but let's assume for a moment that it is true. And while that migration was going on, we had a small set of people working on that migration. But now that the migration is done, we have to teach people how to manage and use Kubernetes, because we have chosen not to use an abstraction like Knative on top of it. How do we teach people Kubernetes as if they're coming to it brand new? They've been used to managing VMs through hypervisors, but now it's all that's gone.
So by teaching people, you're talking about people that are more towards ops, right?
My guess, and this question is from Door, and the question is really, what would you say is a good way to teach Kubernetes to a new team member? That doesn't mean that they're new to tech. It doesn't mean they're new to the company. So let's assume that at least they have tech, they have the basic knowledge of the company and how it works. They're just brand new to Kubernetes and they're coming from bare metal, virtualization, whatever.
Yeah, ops person, right?
That's based on the way the question is stated. It feels more ops-like. Yes.
That's hard to answer. I know that many people like to start with details. Kind of like, hey, let me understand what's below the hood, right? I'm a type of person that actually goes the other way around. I like to learn driving the car first. And then eventually, if I really get into driving cars, to understand what's below the hood of that car. So I like to approach things personally, mostly from the user perspective first, and then go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And how deep any of us goes really depends on circumstances, right? For some people, that's 2 layers deep, sometimes 3, 5, 7, 70, whatever, right? But I personally prefer doing that as a user. Almost maybe going from, even though we're answering for the ops person, starting from the dev perspective, right? Kind of like, okay, so if you would be a developer, this is how you would deploy your application to Kubernetes. And maybe somebody even made some instructions for you, and hopefully, right? And then, okay, so your application is running. Now, how is it running, right? And then you go deeper and deeper and deeper, like kind of, hey, you just created a deployment. Take a look at what that deployment creates. It creates a replica set. Okay. So a replica set creates a pod. Okay. And pod contains containers. Okay. And containers do this. Excellent, right? And the same thing for other pieces. Now, the bad news is that there's overwhelmingly many things that you need to figure out. If you want to have even mediocre understanding of Kubernetes, we are not talking about Kubernetes alone. So understanding of Kubernetes means understanding of Kubernetes plus, whatever we spoke in one of the previous episodes: monitoring, logging, networking, storage, etc., etc., etc. And I don't see any other way than to take each of those subjects almost in isolation, connect with the previous knowledge, move to the next one.
So person shows up on the team. What's their day one?
Deployments. And when I say deployments, I mean Kubernetes deployment kind of resource, right? This is what the deployment is. And day one would be deployment, goes into replica set, it goes into a pod. Pod becomes one or more containers. That's your day one, or maybe day 1 and 2.
But how do you even get to deployment? What's the day 0 to even get to deployment? You have somebody coming in that knows nothing about Kubernetes. 0. They've read no blog posts. They don't know who Kelsey Hightower is. Nothing.
Yeah, but at least in my case, and it's very hard to answer that for others, but so I can only replicate my process, my way of thinking. Kind of, to me, starting with deployment gives me, from the very first minute, something tangible, right?
Okay, so what is a deployment? What is that tangible item?
It's an application running. So we have an application running in a Kubernetes cluster, right? We do not know yet what that cluster is, but we know that there is an application. I can open it in my browser or send a CRL request. I can see that running. I can feel that running. I see the effect of that something. So basically, I'm not starting with the deployment. I'm starting with, here's an application running in Kubernetes. How is that application running? Most likely, it's going to be deployment. It's more common than stateful set, more common than Knative. Knative would be just horrible idea for day 1 anyway. So at least I like in first 15 minutes to have something running. And since we're talking about Kubernetes, it is an application running. To me, Kubernetes running means nothing because you cannot feel it. You cannot touch it. the Kubernetes alone has no value. An application running has value. And then you need to dissect what that application is. And that's why my vote would go deployment and then children of that deployment. Now, some other people probably would start with a container, maybe even Docker, right? And go completely opposite direction from me. This is a container, a pod, collection of containers, replica set, a collection of pods, deployment, collection of replica sets. It's nice to touch things at the very beginning.
So you've opened up a browser, you've got a CLI that you've hit the application, but that tells me about the application. And we've talked through the deployment stack, either top down or bottom up. Understanding that basic concept, and again, throwing stateful set out, which is basically just a superset of deployment.
Yeah, it's very easy to understand stateful set once you understand deployment.
And I think that's key, that you need to understand deployment before you go down the stateful set route.
Yeah.
You've got to understand the basics of container, pod, replica set, deployment. You get that burned in your head, then everything else starts to make a little more sense. But as an operations person, I don't care about applications. Let's say I'm the one that's tasked with not necessarily maintaining everything about Kubernetes, just like as a VMware administrator, you're not tasked with every moving piece of VMware because you're probably not tasked with handling storage in a larger organization. There's a whole nother team that's handling storage.
Exactly. But you are very much focused. If you're doing Kubernetes something, you're focused on applications. Just as if you're a VMware person, you're focused on VMs. That's VMs are the sole purpose why you're a VMware person, right? And applications. And when you say applications, I include cron jobs and all that stuff into applications. Workloads, let's say, right? Processes running is the main and maybe the only purpose of you managing Kubernetes in the first place. There is no other reason why would you have Kubernetes. If you have no process running, applications running, then you have no purpose. You're mistaken in the first place. So it must be an application because that's the reason. That's the purpose of it.
If I have an application, how did that application get into the cluster? Now I'm headed towards day 2. In other words, what is the packaging process to get the application into the cluster and understanding how that, so you show up day 1 and there's an application already running there and you learn the basics of, okay, it's there and here's how it's made up. But day 2 is how did it get there?
Yes, that's a very good choice. That's the direction I would go as well, long before going into monitoring, networking, and this and that. And I would maybe rephrase it a bit. Day 2 would be about pipelines. Maybe it wouldn't, almost certainly wouldn't be in a day, but okay, now that you have an application running, you didn't run it yourself, you understand how that application is running, even though you do not understand how it got there. Now let's talk about pipelines. Let's talk about CI/CD. Even if you're not using pipelines yourself, even if you're doing everything manually, imagine that you have certain steps.
Even if you're doing it manually, that's still a pipeline. It's a checklist.
Exactly.
Automated or not, it's still some sort of pipeline.
Exactly. And then we start talking about, I'm going to exclude silly things that you almost certainly know, kind of like check out the code, like clone the code, things like that. Day 2 would be building images, right? How do you build images? Without an image, you have nothing in Kubernetes. There is simply, again, it serves no purpose because applications are all of a sudden not running anymore. So day 2 would be build your container images and store them somewhere. And that sounds like a trivial thing, but it requires a bit of work to figure it out, how to do it well and stuff like that. Like a Docker file itself can get a bit of getting used to.
And you call out a very interesting point there. Day 1, we saw an application running. Day 2, we're trying to figure out how to build an image, fill in the blank, however that's going to be. Do you have Docker running on a standalone machine that's automated that you're going to be doing other things with, or are you actually building in cluster, meaning you're using Canico or some other set of tooling? You have a registry, so understanding the concept of a registry and realizing when it's all said and done that it's basically nothing more than a smart place to store big tarballs, because that's all an image is.
Exactly. And I wouldn't even go that far as whether it should be building in cluster or building outside of the cluster. Forget about Canary. It's really understanding how to define an image, how to build an image, build it with Docker, whatever is the easiest way to do it, whatever is the most natural, whatever somebody else, whomever is teaching you, is doing. Later on, that would be day 35 or whatever the number is. Hey, should we do it in cluster with Canary, right? Those are already details that do not really change the story much. The tools might change, but the story is still the same. The experience is the same, and so on and so forth. What does matter is, what is a container image? How do we define it? How do we build it? And where do we store it? And when I say store it, I mean literally store it. Forget even about, don't go into rabbit hole of, for example, do some scanning of the images and then getting depressed for 5 days on day 2, right? Just build it, store it somewhere.
Just build it, store it somewhere. And that's the end of day 2. Now, day 3 is, okay, how do we get that image out of the registry and into our cluster?
Exactly. Then we are talking about modifying the manifest, those that we explored on day 1, and understanding the process of the rollout process. On day 1, you understood what is a deployment, what replica set, pods, containers, in whichever direction you went. Now we're talking about, okay, so there is something called rolling updates. You change the tag, you just build the image, you change the tag in your manifest, you apply the tag. We're not talking about anything fancy, kubectl, no GitOps or any of those things. And then you start seeing live how the day 1 is actually progressing. What is actually really deployment doing with replica sets, and what are replica sets doing with individual pods, and how some of them are being created, others are being shut down, how that avoids downtime depending on the architecture you have, and all those things. It's almost like day 3 maybe would be like day 1 in action by you. Day 1 was set up by somebody else. Now it's you doing day 1.
And that way, once you've finished day 3, now you could help onboard somebody into day 1.
Yes.
Right, because now it's progressed. You're now back to day 1. But then we're through 3 days, which in reality could be 3 weeks or 3 months.
Yeah. I assumed all the time that when we say day 1, it doesn't mean literally day 1.
But we're out of day 3 and we're headed towards day 4. What's day 4? Is it monitoring? Is it logging? Is it tracing?
I think that the first 3 days that we talked about can be applied to almost anybody. Day 4 already depends. Like day 4 maybe could be about stateful sets. Or maybe you don't have them, right? That's where we go beyond what absolutely everybody has. Maybe you don't have monitoring because maybe your cluster is actually too small for you to bother with monitoring. Or maybe no centralized logging because your cluster is too small, right? I would probably spend a bit more time on, I'm not going to name them explicitly, but other Kubernetes resource types. And especially with custom resource. Understanding that, for day 4 would be understanding the extensibility of Kubernetes. And getting a feeling that out-of-the-box Kubernetes is not the end goal. It's built to be extensible. And whether you like it or no, you're almost certainly having a lot of custom resource definitions in your Kubernetes doing different things. Because once you understand the extensibility model of Kubernetes, and especially custom resource definitions and operators, you will be using that knowledge to go faster through the other topics. Because that really falls into monitoring, logging, almost anything else. Especially if those other subjects, you take it from both directions of this is how you do it from user perspective. Because from user perspective, you do not necessarily need to understand Kubernetes extensibility to use logging. But then from operation perspective, you definitely need to understand that because logging is going to create new resources in Kubernetes. Monitoring is going to create new resources. Everything creates new resources. Almost everything that you deploy to Kubernetes as third-party system-level application is extending Kubernetes, and you need to understand those extensions because they bring with them new kinds of manifests that you will be using, and new resources that you will be monitoring, and so on and so forth.
So it sounds like day 4 is dependent upon your role. I mean, maybe day 4 is for all the roles still anyway.
It is actually. I started with depends on the roles, but ended up by probably going towards understanding extensibility model of Kubernetes. Because then if day 5 would start diverging depending on the company role and specific situation, but that extensibility model will help you go whether day 5 is going to be logging, monitoring, networking, this or that. Extensibility is going to be the base for all of those.
Right, because that's the jumping off point, because by the time you get to day 5, if you're an SRE, you're going to be looking at basically pods and down. You may not care as much about replica sets or deployments. You just care about are things actually spinning up or not. Unless it's a stateful set, then you've got to understand the basics of persistent volumes and those kinds of things.
Yeah, kind of. The truth is that everything that runs, everything that physically exists is a container in Kubernetes. But then in order for you to understand why something is misbehaving, you need to go up from that container, up, right? The first example from day 1, up means pod replica set deployment. But then there is infinite amount of other pods, and majority of them not being even in Kubernetes itself.
Here's one thing we didn't discuss in any of the days up to this point. And I have a feeling it probably needs to be in day 2 or 3. Or probably day 1, or it's got to be in day 3, I think, where we're actually modifying the manifest, is understanding the concepts of Ingress. Because, or is it? Am I overthinking that?
I think that I would do that still in day 1. That's kind of still, it's my application. We're not going into details yet, but I actually did not probably explain it well. When I said deployment, I actually meant more than deployment. I meant there is a deployment that creates replica set, creates a pod. There is, let's say, a service, and there is Ingress and maybe 2 or 3 more things, right? All those things constitute an application. When we say an application Kubernetes, we mean those things. And that can differ from one company to another, but in a very basic form, it's a deployment, a service, and Ingress. I think that those 3 would be the bare minimum for something that you can touch.
And then going back to day 5, this is where the different learning paths kick in. Am I an SRE? And if you haven't adopted the SRE stance yet, Am I an ops person? Am I a support person for deploying the applications? Am I fill in the blank? Whatever it is based on your culture.
In your specific role, because your role might be very generic, like I'm a DevOps person, SRE person that does a bit of everything and then toss a coin type of solution, right? Up from that there on. But if it's larger organization, then your focus would be slightly more towards security aspect of it or monitoring aspect of it. We might be going into specialization, or maybe not necessarily specialization. Like I'm only into monitoring, but usually we all, especially in bigger organizations, we might be generalists, but up to a level. But there is kind of like, this is my focus slightly more than other focuses, right?
Right, because you may be, again, we're now at day 5+, you might be the person that's tasked with making sure that the images are secure from a supply chain perspective. So the basics of day 3, for you understanding how the Docker file and its associated code that's in that repository gets baked into an image, and you understand how the scanning of that image is critical to be deployed out to the cluster. Not so much that you're concerned about the image actually deploying to the cluster, but you understand the importance of that image being as secure as possible. So you're living in tools like maybe SNCC or Defect Dojo or whatever to keep track of CVEs. CVE is now your new language. And that might be, even though you're a generalist, that might be your focus for what you're doing. And you've got somebody else that you're helping train along so you can actually take a vacation. And hopefully both of you are working together to try to automate yourselves out of that part of your job, because it's going to be a long learning curve. Thinking back to the previous episode of, okay, we're getting ready to migrate everything to Kubernetes. Well, your role in the past may have been to manage X-ray inside of Artifactory, but now what is that new variation to where everything's a container image? Because you're not dealing with jar files in the raw anymore, even though you need them to be inside the image. Because previously, let's say it was a Java application, you were building a WAR file and deploying it just to an operating system. Somebody else was managing the security of the operating system, you were managing the security of the WAR file, everything was wonderful. Well, now, in a container image, you're managing the OS and the application, and the WAR file, and the everything else. So things have shifted right, even though you're shifting it more left. That's confusing, isn't it?
The important part is that, like when learning anything, you need a base, and base would be those 4 days, as we mentioned, give or take, right? We did not really think it through deeply, but give or take, those 4 days are a base, and then where you go from there, that's where, after you figure out the base that everybody needs to know, then that's where paths start diverging. Ultimately, the goal, if you're not specialized into one thing, ultimately it's whole CNCF plus what comes after.
Let's recap the 4 days. Day 1.
Your application is running and you understand the components that constitute an application. Containers, pods, replicas, deployment, services, Ingress.
Day 2.
What was it, day 2? I already forgot. See, I'm old.
Build the image and get it into a registry.
Exactly. CI/CD or pipeline steps. Build image, deploy a new release on top of the one that was running.
That was day 3. Yeah, so that's the manifest is day 3.
Oh, was it day? Yeah. Build. Yeah. okay.
Build was day 2.
Build
manifest
image,
change was day 3.
Yeah. Update your application day 3.
Yeah. And then day 4. The basics of monitoring, observability. Yeah, I think that's what you said. We can't rewind and listen to it as we're recording it, but it's something like that. It was the extensibility. Understanding the extensibility.
Understanding the extensibility, correct. Because everything else that will be coming afterwards is going to be most likely extensions of that Kubernetes. So understanding extensibility model of Kubernetes is day 4, yes. It took me a while to remember what I just said 15 minutes ago. I do not even understand how I'm doing what I'm doing.
And this just goes to prove that we have an idea of where we're going, but we don't have real notes. So we just couldn't remember what it was. So what do you think? How do you bring new people on to teach them Kubernetes? Head over to the Slack workspace, go over to the podcast channel, and leave us your comments. We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.